Binta, thank you so much for joining us. I usually would do sort of an introduction, but as you know, there are some standard questions that we go through first. And the very first question is, in 2 minutes or less, tell us about your career story. How did you get to where you are professionally today?
Okay. Emil, thanks again for having me. And thank you for saving me from myself because I've been washing my hands a whole lot. Showers, on the other hand, is a different story. But so thank you for saving me this morning. Okay.
Right, you
So
we all had to actually get out of our pajamas today.
yeah. So I kind of started out in the nonprofit sector. I worked as an education director at a Boys and Girls Club, and then I was promoted to the assistant director within my first year there. And I really had a special encounter with one of the club's members, which left me really curious about human behavior that I ended up leaving a year later to pursue I ended up earning a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling. And I practiced mental health for about a decade in a wide variety of settings with diverse populations. And then after some reflection, I realized that I was really ready for a career pivot. And so I wanted to seek an opportunity where both my management degree as well as my counseling degrees married really well. And so that kind of came in the form of accepting the director of career services position at a mid-sized university. And that was probably one of the most exhausting and exhilarating experiences of my career. I loved every moment of it. And at the beginning of my fourth year in that role, I followed my spouse to Austin, where I was able to secure my current position at UT as the dual career and recruitment consultant. That's a mouthful. It's quite a hybrid role because I work for both human resources as well as the provost office. And for human resources, I spearhead a program called Smart Hire, which pretty much I advise campus search committees for mid to upper level and hard to fill positions in all phases of the recruitment process towards a successful hire. And this role has kind of expanded into developing and facilitating workshops around implicit bias in the workplace, as well as implicit bias in the hiring process. And for the provost office, I provide a suite of career services to trailing spouses, whom I may add, professionals in their own right, of high-profile faculty the university wishes to recruit to campus. So that's the last, 15, almost 20 years of, my career journey.
Good, that's great. And you talk about your master's degree, but you're back in school again, right?
I am. I tell you, I do these things to myself, Emil. So right now I'm pursuing a doctoral degree in leadership and learning in organization at Vanderbilt University. So I'm back and forth to Nashville quite frequently, but I'm committed to it. So I graduate next May. So
Oh, good. Great. A year from now. Great. Good. Okay. So next standard question, what does leadership mean to you?
Oh, that's leadership is such an elusive concept. I mean, since I've been studying it really closely the last 2.5 years, I mean, despite all the articles and the studies and the theories and the books, making it actually a $50 billion industry with no signs of slowing down, by the way. I think this concept of leadership has yet to be sufficiently defined, so to speak. So I'll just give you my very broad and working definition. I truly believe that leadership is about leveraging one's relationships to work well with and through other people towards some kind of desirable outcome. In times of disruptions, much like our present day, but also in what I like to call the everydayness. Now, don't get me wrong, I still nurture the traditional view of leadership where I think it's, a person who sets the direction, who rallies the troops, who makes key decisions, all legitimate functions. But I think at its core, for me, it's about leveraging those relationships. And I certainly don't think that, leadership for me, it's a one size fits none. I mean, if you look at leadership styles of Phil Jackson versus Steve Jobs, we can all argue that or agree that they had successful outcomes, but they went about doing it very different in a very different manner. So, I think of the characteristic of the person, the leader specifically. I think about the characteristic of their followers, and also the characteristics of the situation. So I really think it's fluid. If you ask me that question in the next 10 years, my answer may vary. So there you have it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And it's leadership and leadership theory, it's always evolving. So it makes sense that one's definition, understanding, or philosophy of leadership is also going to evolve. I mean, even, day to day, there's always something new to consider. If we sort of blink, we're going to miss something. You always have to sort of stay plugged in
Yeah.
and understand leadership. But you did talk about what you're sort of understanding of leadership and understanding that their followers. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that? It's what I understood you to say was to understand a leader, you really have to understand their followers. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you're familiar with this video about the leadership of the dancing guy, or I'm butchering it completely, where they say it's actually not the very first person that's really critical in getting things done. It's actually the other folks that are willing to
Yeah.
follow them, that actually trust them and believe in their vision and their purpose, and the leader gets to kind of draw out all the genius, so to speak, out of their followers. And that's what kind of sets the tone and creates this kind of energy around getting things done successfully. So I think it's not just, leadership is not a solo sport, so to speak. It's not just about the leader. It's equally important as, their followers. So.
Okay, great, thanks. So this next question is a choose your own adventure. What do you suspect or know bothers people about you as a leader? Or what is your leadership weakness?
Okay, so this one's
Or both, if you want.
this one is actually pretty easy because I received this piece of feedback from a 360 evaluation from a former team of mine. So when I came into this new leadership position, I had to restaff the entire department. And the department already had a pretty fragile reputation with its key stakeholders. And so knowing the expectations were high for me, things moving at the speed of light, and just kind of working with a relatively new team, trying to address the urgent needs of the present day while planning for the future. I really think that I fell into this leadership trap of taking a very hands-on approach rather than just kind of getting out of the way of my team and just giving them the freedom to make the tough and best decisions. I mean, the piece of feedback literally was, Binta, you are about to drive us crazy. and I'm thankful because we established such great relationships from the onset that they felt comfortable providing that honest and critical feedback for me to just kind of pivot and reflect and really adjust my style, being more of a support and guidance for my team, and just letting them do what they were hired to do. Why hire people to solve problems if you don't trust them to actually go ahead and do it? So that's always my go-to response in that, because in retrospect I can laugh at it, but when I look back at it, I was like, oh my god, I would have drove myself crazy. So that was a really valuable leadership learning lesson for me personally.
So that's one of the elements of the 5 dysfunctions of a team. You have to create an environment that allows for that constructive critical feedback in all ways. So the fact that people could tell you're driving us crazy is an important culture to have set for you. So, but what specifically was driving them crazy?
I think that I think it was my personal motivations that would drive me. I felt like, because again,
Oh, I see.
Expectations were high. I was in a predominantly white institution. I am Black female international, given all of those compounding effects, I felt like I was responsible for every single aspect of what was happening and the outcomes. And I felt like at the time, if I didn't have a say or a hand in every single thing, if something went awry, obviously it fell back on me, but I felt, it was my responsibility to just kind of be everywhere, manage really. And I learned really quickly that that can cause more havoc than good. I mean, just give people the freedom to just kind of do their best work. So.
Okay, good. Okay, the next couple are coronavirus, COVID-19 related. We're, as I mentioned at the start, we're doing this during a very unique, challenging time. And what advice do you have for people as they struggle with their own career development in general, and of course, during this time in particular?
Yeah, these are really historic and tough times, ML. When I think about career development, and I read a whole lot about career development, I think on average we will spend about 90,000 hours at work in our lifetime, some more than others, which is a heck of a long time. But some studies have shown that 70% of us are not happy with our careers. And no one really teaches us about how to build a career that suits our needs. And I think gone are the days where career development meant upward progression. I think today it's more about growth through new experiences and experiences that the employee, he or herself, has to really tap into by using their network. So a couple of pieces of advice I would give for folks that might be struggling in this area right now. I think it's good to be reflective. Reflect on your career path. What exactly is missing? What has changed since your first day on the job? Is it money? Is it flexibility? Is it, a lack of professional growth opportunities? What are your values, both personal and professional, because they intersect. What do you want out of a job? What do you offer to a job, And once you can start answering those critical questions, I think it's, you can start figuring out where can you access the resources to help you fill in those missing gaps. So another thing that I would encourage folks to do is, there's no short supply of information. Explore career options online. There's so many jobs that exist today that didn't 3 years ago. And so one of my go-to resources is ONET online, and I'm happy to send a whole bunch of resources for you to share with folks. It's pretty comprehensive. I mean, anything you could possibly want to know about a particular occupation, it will tell you, like the education and credentials, related occupations, work values, anything from wages and employment trends in that occupation. Another piece of advice I would say, inventory your skills. Now is a good time to do that. What skills do you have that really adds value to the job? And can you quantify them? What are some areas that you may need some more developmental learning? And, now is a great time to earn new skills through online learning. And again, there's no short supply of opportunities to do that. I think there are like close to 9,500 massive open online courses. There are over 100,000 TED Talks. There are several hundred videos on YouTube. Many Ivy League schools are offering free online classes like Yale and Harvard. I've taken classes at Yale in the past. Of course, our very own UT Learn, LinkedIn Learning. I mean, there's Salesforce, there's so many, ML. So, I mean, whatever you think that you want to learn or you think you want to develop a skill in, now is a good time to do that. Two more pieces of advice I would give is make time to network, because networking can really give you critical advice. It can help you make introductions and really just kind of support you on this career journey. And then for me, mentors, and I say that plural because in this complex landscape in which we work, I think it's important to build a diverse squad, so to speak, or a board of advisories from a wide variety of industries with a wide variety of experiences and talents. And don't ever discount the value of taking a lateral move to really deepen and broaden your experiences, because I think that really diversifies your portfolio.
Yeah, networking can sort of have it's kind of a dirty word in some ways, but I think it's because people feel that it's more about trying to sell yourself, but it should be a learning experience. So when we hear that advice of networking, and we can do that now, even though we have what we're calling social distancing, which should really be called just physical distancing, because we shouldn't have any social distance between us. There's no need for that. We can still network remotely. Of course, it's not as personable, but you can still network. And when you do so, you should be the learner. You should be somebody who is learning from others.
I agree. I actually think it's two ways.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
mean, and so I will learn something from you and vice versa. I think it's just about learning to nurture the relationship in a meaningful way where you're not trying to take, but you're also giving back in the process as well.
Okay, so let's move on to our next question here. One of the most important roles, as we're getting kind of to the meat of this discussion, for a leader is to develop others. What can leaders do right now to fulfill that role while we navigate these troubling waters during COVID-19?
Yeah. I mean, beyond COVID-19, ML, I think that leaders first have to identify that career growth and development is one of the top factors that employees identify as a must-have from their employer. And I think it's directly related to employee motivation, engagement, retention. And when you think about it, employability is everyone's greatest asset, you know? And so I think for leaders to provide meaningful work, stretch projects that will continue to develop their team and ultimately strengthen their unit or organization. I think first and foremost, I think it's important for leaders to really know the strengths and potential of their team, especially during a crisis, because at the end of the day, you really cannot leverage an unknown asset. It's impossible to do that. I think it's also important for leaders to get to know their team's bandwidth, especially in during this pandemic, because everybody is dealing with the effects of this health crisis differently. And so some members of their team may have more bandwidth for certain projects and tasks than others, but don't necessarily make an assumption and make decisions for your team without consulting them. I think another key way for leaders to kind of develop their team is by modeling some of those soft skills as well. I don't necessarily always have to go attend a conference or take a 1-hour course online. If they demonstrate really good, effective communication, having opportunities to cross-train and work collaboratively across the organization towards meaningful projects. Asking them for their opinions, getting them involved in some of the solutions, because we're all learning in this process as well. I think these are all some ideas that leaders can kind of take on to just, further the development of their team. But first and foremost, they really have to know what their team strengths and potentials are. Because again, you can't leverage that asset if you really don't know it. So
you really covered the next question already, which was why do you think that developing others is so important for a leader? But if there's anything you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, I think honestly, Emil, I think it's the only way for us to truly build learning and sustainable organizations. The more capable and qualified your employees are, the better they perform. That's increasing productivity. They're able to quickly leverage new technologies to meet new responsibilities and demand. And it again, like I said, it's directly related to reducing turnover and engagement and morale. I think according to a Gallup poll a couple of years ago, or Gallup study, sorry, I think it said that 85% of us function below our potential and we're not engaged. And so I think our systems has a tendency of pushing us to habitual ways of learning and thinking and doing, where 40% of our action is done on autopilot. So if you were to think about the power in cultivating a habit around learning and developing others, just think of the impact it would have on an organization's bottom line, you know? So,
So given that, then why do so many leaders and managers resist developing others?
okay, so honestly, I think first and foremost, I think because leaders are rewarded on the performance of their team and not on developing others and promoting others. I mean, but if you think about if a leader had to build their reputation on, excuse me, developing others and getting people promoted, that person would immediately become a talent magnet, you know? I think another possibility is that issue of time. I think some leaders believe that developing others takes an obscene amount of time, but I truly believe that it can be done in 15, 20-minute increments because at the end of the day, the onus of developing others, I don't think it completely it falls on the shoulders of the leaders. I think employees need to have some skin in the game as well. And another possibility is the lack of know-how. You know, people can't give you what they don't have, ML, period. If this behavior has never been modeled for a leader, it's kind of hard to expect them to provide that for their team, you know? And then there's also that perceived threat to the status quo. Some leaders are just insecure. They feel like maybe if I develop others, they may, you know, come for my job, or
Overshadow them, yeah.
yeah, they may leave the organization. And I think of, you know, the worst case scenario is if you don't develop them and they stay in the organization, what are the effects of that, you know? So.
Okay, good. So both of us are pretty strong advocates of creating a learning organization. What does establishing a culture of learning have to do with helping people and organizations grow professionally?
Okay, so common mistakes that I see people. Oh, okay. So
This is a very macro question. So
yes,
just thinking about it, large sort of organization-wide, you know, thinking about how important it is for an organization to create that culture of continuous learning. But how is that related to professionally developing people?
okay, so I'm going to approach this maybe slightly different than, you know, the typical response. So I think, okay, you and I both agree that this concept of learning organizations is not a new phenomenon, but I really see it as the only sustainable source of competitive advantage. I mean, I don't mean to sound gloom and you know, but I think it's essential for our survival. And let me elaborate just a little bit. I think there's a large interest in building learning ecosystems right now, because if you follow any of the macro trends like social, economic, demographic, for instance, you know, one example is the fertility rate in most developed countries like the US, UK, Japan, you know, they are well below replacement, but people are living longer. So there are lots of demographic shifts in the workforce. And just think of the impact on the GDP. So in order for the GDP to continue growing, we really have to focus on the quality of labor and not the quantity of labor. So that's in the form of upskilling and reskilling our current labor force. And then you see other trends like the gig economy, that's part-time, freelance, contract workers. They make up at least 40% of the workforce. And they've contributed about $1 trillion annually to our economy. So these trends, along with AI, automation, globalization, the emergence of sharing economies. I mean, just think Airbnb, DoorDash, Uber, all of these are reshaping our workforce. And the compounding effect is that the dreaded skills gap continues to widen, and it continues to be top of mind for a lot of leaders. And so it's imperative, I think, for us to foster this habit of continuous learning. We really cannot rely on the hope that new talent entering the workforce will be skill ready to solve tomorrow's problems. because that's just not going to happen. We really have to figure out how learning works best in our organizations and really optimize learning initiatives to fit the varying organizational context. So that's my answer to that question.
That's good. No, that's great. The next one is a two-parter. First, so how would you define, you touched on this already, how would you define a learning organization? And then the second part is, in your experience and through your research, what separates a learning organization from other organizations? So in other words, what makes a learning organization powerful?
Okay, so I mean, at the core, when I think of learning organizations, I think the people within the organization, I think the learning resources available to the people, that's both internal and external, and I think the technology that facilitates that learning, right? But ultimately, I define a learning organization as an environment where people or employees excel at creating, acquiring, and transferring knowledge in order to adapt, to be agile, to be flexible, and to thrive in conditions that are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I can't even say that word. I also think about the structures that support knowledge sharing, idea development, framing failures as positive learning experiences where leadership behavior really reinforces learning in the organization, and then where there are established processes and practice for learning. So, it could be experimenting with new and better ways of working, looking at trends and data and best in class and all of those things. Now, what separates a learning organization, I think you don't know what you don't know, Emil. So I think it's important to conduct a learning needs assessment and using the information from that to build learning strategies across the organization. Look at how motivation and learning intersect, how and why it changes over time. Perhaps setting learning as a core competency, encouraging employees to learn at any point throughout the day, and connecting their learning to the organization's larger priorities and goals. Utilizing synchronous and asynchronous contents to add flexibility. And some people may agree, I think that learning organizations need to be employee-led, because I think people will learn what they need to learn, not what somebody else thinks that they need to learn. So giving the employee the freedom and control to just kind of learn. And the presence of psychological safety is so incredibly important, because if you feel attacked or marginalized or threatened, that creates stress and that impacts learning. So, that's what I think, sets one organization apart in terms of, being a learning organization.
Yeah, that sort of exploration aspect that you touched on is really important, and the idea that you should be able to see sort of this direct link between what the person is currently doing and the learning that they're going through can be dangerous, because we don't know. The whole point is to explore. We need to allow people to get out there and learn wherever that might be, because that's the only way to innovate. If you're only learning for people that have gone through it in a specific setting, then we're not going to have the ability to create something new and change something, because they're not looking at it from a different perspective.
Yeah, and I think an organization should explore the link between performance and learning, So
Right.
I think that could just kind of shed a lot of light on how we can do so much more and be so much more productive and effective and innovative and creative and, as an organization.
So is UT a learning organization?
So
Yet?
I think working and learning are closely related, and it's an essential part of understanding our work. I think learning occurs across, it happens all the time and across all human activity. So, as activities are inherently social, I think of elements of, one's membership in the community of practice, their identity, their participation in those communities. I think all of these things are indivisible pillars that we must consider when we're addressing the learning in organizations. So my short answer is, yeah, I think UT is a learning organization. Most organizations are. I think we haven't created a narrative around what learning is and how we can do it effectively and how we can leverage that. Because I mean, if you were to take a straw poll and ask UT employees, what's the one thing that's holding them back from learning at work, they're probably going to say time. you know
Right.
but my learning practice, Emil, every single day I set aside either 5 minutes to 60 minutes for micro learning. So either I read an article, I listen to a podcast, I do 20 minutes of an hour-long online course. I mean, every single day, that's my practice, and I find ways to connect it to the work that I do currently or work that I aspire to do. So
Great. Okay, we're running a little short on time, so let's jump to the closing standard questions. Number one, what are you reading right now?
So I just cracked open this book by Karen Catlin, I think it's called Better Allies, Everyday Actions to Create Inclusive and Engaging Workplaces. But since I have to do a lot of reading for school, I've been a podcast fiend. So some of my favorite podcasts is the new rules of work, securing the seat, inside outside. I listen to a lot of podcasts.
Okay, good. So I should say, everybody, that you may be posing some questions on Facebook right now, and we might be able to get to them right now. Actually, we won't, because we're already short on time, but hopefully we'll be able to respond to them later, and maybe we can add some of those podcasts and books on the comment feed. So 2 more questions here. What is the hardest thing that you have had to do as a leader?
Well, I hate reliving this one. So in a former position, my supervisor, who was a member of the upper administration at that university, requested me to give access to a confidential record-keeping system containing both career and counseling session notes with students to a head of a pretty prominent academic college, who, by the way, that individual was also related to the university's president. Had I said yes, agreed to this would have been a complete breach of confidentiality. And I explained this to my supervisor on numerous occasions, but his response was always make it happen. Of course, I respectfully declined his request, and I did offer reasonable alternatives, but although it was the right thing to do, Emil, it still felt icky given my positional power versus theirs and how well connected that they were to the university and the community. And so by far, that has been the toughest decision that I've had to make as a leader.
Yeah, that's awkward.
It is.
Okay, so last question. Give me 2 key pieces of leadership advice.
Maybe it's occupational hazard as a counselor, as a therapist. I always strive to take the human approach and lead with kindness and empathy, because how you treat people will always set the tone for the team and create a culture around the larger purpose of the organization. And 2, I think operating with a growth mindset, around your practices, your policies, and your decisions is key.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Binta, for joining us. Again, we'll try and make some comments on the Facebook feed at a later date, and we will do this again next month. And UT Learning and Development will continue to try and deliver some more content during these days when we're doing everything remotely. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Binta, thank you, and I'll see you around the ether. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.